Art, architecture, government, law. These are some of the important achievements we think of when discussing ancient Rome. The foundation of Western civilization, the father of European empire, ancient Rome is long hailed as the greatest power of its era and one of the great empires of world history. Its territory stretching all the way from England to Egypt, Spain to Babylon, until it all collapsed in 476 CE at the hands, or spears I should say, of bordering Germanic tribes, spurring Europe's long decline into the Dark Ages. But many scholars would argue that another, more insidious element should be added to the long list of Roman legacies. We all know of the barbarians at the gate that caused the Western Empire to fall, but is there more to the story? Starting in the late 20th century, scholars have begun to examine Rome from a new perspective, an environmental and toxicological one. Enter lead poisoning. Lead toxicity is a prevalent environmental disease tracing back to ancient times, and its effects on the human body are devastating, especially on the brain. It is well known that the Romans used lead for a myriad of purposes, whether it be weaponry, aqueducts, cosmetics, or most importantly, wine. To sweeten their wines and delicacies, the Romans would boil down grapes into syrups in lead pots and lead-lined copper kettles. When scholars attempted to replicate ancient Roman recipes, they yielded syrups with lead concentrations of 240 to 1,000 milligrams per liter. Now that is a lot of lead. In fact, just 1 teaspoon of this syrup would be more than enough to cause the degenerative symptoms of lead poisoning. As more evidence mounts, scholars have begun to wonder whether large-scale lead toxicity caused emperors to go mad, populations to decline, and the Roman Empire to fall. Rome is infamous for its deranged, cruel, and often flamboyant emperors. Some researchers like Jerome Riagu posit that the consumption of lead-tainted Roman wine precipitated brain damage, contributing to the madness seen in some of Rome's most eminent autocrats. Upon examining the diets of 30 Roman leaders between 30 BCE and 220 CE, Riagu found that 19 of them likely suffered with sleeplessness, stomach problems, mental impairment, or gout. Common findings correlated with chronic lead intake. Such emperors may have included Caligula, a perpetrator of sexual atrocities, Nero, the tyrannical antichrist who let Rome burn, and Claudius, who was famously clumsy, dull-witted, and absent-minded. Nriagu goes so far as to claim that the high lead intake found in favorite Roman wines were enough to contribute to the decline of the Roman Empire. According to Nriagu, an average aristocrat in Rome had a daily lead intake up to 8 times the modern American, far, far above danger levels. But what's the deal with lead? I mean, how bad could it really be for some researchers to entertain the idea that it had a part to play in the fall of Rome? We know a lot about lead's adverse health effects. Categorized as a heavy metal, lead is a normal constituent of the Earth's crust, with trace amounts naturally occurring in soil, plant, and water. It becomes highly toxic when mined and transformed by humans through industry, and as a result of our actions, this toxic substance disperses through the environment into air, soil, lakes, and rivers, whether it be via pollution like factory emissions, consumer products, pipes, and paint of old houses. We only have to look to the water crisis in Flint, Michigan to see that lead toxicity is still a problem we face today when not properly taken care of. But why lead? Well, it's easy to access, easy to work with, and has remarkable application in pretty much everything. So since antiquity, we've been mining lead for its incredible versatility, which has made it very commercially attractive. Just look at your batteries, cosmetics, paints, and pipes. The issue with lead is that whether it be via inhalation or ingestion, it accumulates in the body even when exposed to low doses. It is quickly absorbed in the bloodstream and builds up throughout the body, producing a wide range of effects from debilitating headaches, inability to concentrate, irritability and aggressive behavior, as well as reproductive problems, anemia, and much more. Children are even more vulnerable, absorbing lead at faster rates than adults because their bodies are still developing, experiencing devastating effects such as reduced IQ, loss of developmental skills, and slowed body growth. And that all just scratches the surface. While our body can dispose of lead, the half-life in our bloodstream is around 30 to 40 days, the problem is that we are often exposed to it at a faster rate than we can get rid of it. And so as a result, it continuously accumulates in tissues, and especially bone, which continuously releases it back into the bloodstream over time. In terms of its mechanism of toxicity, lead mimics calcium and tends to bind strongly to sulfur-hydryl groups on proteins, causing inhibition or malfunctioning in some of our most important bodily processes. The effects of lead poisoning is permanent and its consequences devastating. It causes rampant intellectual deterioration and abnormal behavior problems. Children grow up brain damaged with an impaired ability to speak or think, leaving them unable to reach their full potential. But thankfully, due to heavy regulations, exposure has dramatically reduced in the 21st century, where the limit for maximum daily intake of lead is 1.0 micrograms over grams, which is quite tiny. However, this was not so much the case in ancient times, particularly in ancient Rome. The Romans conducted lead mining on a scale never seen before in human history, to a level not surpassed until the Industrial Revolution more than 1,000 years later. Not only was lead in big demand, but it was a byproduct of refining silver and gold ore, other prized resources of Roman high society. Tens of thousands of slaves and laborers were employed in mines, foundries, and smelter sites across the empire with primitive hygiene and sanitation. For example, just one smelter site in Spain, uncovered by archaeologists, required tens of thousands of slaves to operate. Lead poisoning during Roman times has been generally associated with inhalation from lead mining, but scholars are split on whether serious lead pollution could have afflicted ordinary citizens in Roman urban settlements. The word plumbing is derived from the Latin word for lead, plumbum. Due to lead's malleability and low melting point, it was ideal for the production of water pipes, or aqueducts, which were used extensively to bring water from lakes into urban settlements, supplying water to public baths, latrines, fountains, and private houses. As such, Romans on the daily were drinking, bathing in, and watering their crops with contaminated water from lead-lined water conduits, or so it was believed. There are two major problems with this hypothesis. First is that Roman engineers and intellectuals were actually quite aware of the dangers of lead, and so pipes made of earthenware were actually preferred. More on that later. Secondly, the rivers which fed two of Rome's principal aqueducts had high levels of dissolved calcium carbonate, which would essentially harden into a limestone crust that would serve as a protective layer between flowing water and the lead-sheeted pipes. Additionally, there were not really any taps that could sort of shut off the aqueducts, and so water would not have really been in prolonged contact with the lead. And scientists actually tested this. They measured lead isotopes in sediment of the Tiber River and Trajanic Harbor, finding that piped water contained actually 100 times as much lead as spring water. However, the concentrations found were not enough to cause any serious effects on a massive scale. Roman populations were exposed to lead in various other ways apart from mining and aqueducts. From facial powders, ointments, and coins, to projectiles and shipping/building industries and materials, lead was pretty pervasive in Roman society. However, lead absorption through touch and skin is minimal. The real risks for urban dwellers came from ingestion. Lead poisoning was believed to be born in the kitchen. Cooking utensils and containers were lined with lead, which provided a sweetish flavor to counter the metallic taste of bronze and copper in food, and more importantly, in wine. Lead is naturally sweet in taste, and was found to enhance the flavor of every aristocrat's favorite drink, wine. The Romans shipped their wines all over their vast empire, but in order to do so, a preservative was needed to stop the wine from spoiling. Unlike the Greeks, who added pine tree resin to their wines as a preservative, the Romans preferred sapa and defrutum, boiled down concentrates of grape juice, which had a sweet aromatic taste because they were boiled in, you guessed it, lead-lined vats and pots. lead would leach into the syrup because of the highly acidic content of the grape juice. And so these sweet aromatic syrups found in wine all over the empire contained massive amounts of lead, potentially having around 1 gram of lead per liter. Additionally, because of sapa and defrutum's pleasant flavor, Romans began using this lead-contaminated product as a sweetener in foods. Sugar was unknown back then, and honey extremely expensive, and so grape must concentrate became the go-to sweetener. And by no means was any of this accidental. Lead pots and kettles were purposely used to produce this desirable taste. Today, researchers estimate that 50 to 60% of a free adult Roman lead intake likely came from lead-tainted wine, especially among the nobility and the rich, who drank up to 2 liters of wine per day. As such, they would have been most predisposed to lead poisoning, a disease of the wealthy. The Roman aristocrat probably ingested 250 mg of lead per day. When taken together with other stratas of society, scholars estimate the intake of lead to vary between 35 mg a day to 250 mg a day. Compare that to the daily intake of 0.3 mg a day in the US in the 1980s. This is where speculation arises, that lead poisoning played a role in the madness and incompetence of Roman emperors, who had the power to trigger imperial decline on a larger level. Insanity and defective mental faculties may have resulted from copious ingestion of lead through wine, so some scholars suggest. Rome's sweet tooth was its Achilles heel. Today we know that there's a relationship between gout and chronic lead poisoning, which was the disease that plagued the upper classes of Rome. Additionally, we know that lead is a potent neurotoxicant, and in analyzing the bizarre behavior of most of Roman leaders and the surrounding upper classes, a good case can be made that lead perhaps played a role in a declining Roman society. But did the ancients understand the dangers that lead posed? Were they aware of the risks associated with lead poisoning? The most fascinating aspect of this story is that ancient writers were aware of lead's poisonous properties. Lead's toxicity was recognized and recorded as far back as 250 BCE, when the Greek writer Nicander of Colophon tied the use of white lead to colic and anemia. Roman writers were similarly knowledgeable. And so here we find a paradox regarding the perception of risk. If the Romans knew lead was dangerous, why did they still use it in their cooking preparations? Did they not realize that lead was harmful when using their products? Or did they know that it was bad but still use it anyway because it produced tasty food and delectable drinks? Just like how we today drink alcohol, smoke cigarettes, and consume sugary processed foods on the daily because we love the taste of it, even when aware of its dangers. As autoimmune disorders and cancer rates rise across the world, this thought becomes even more interesting and distressing. Perhaps we are not so different to the Romans as you may think. What is clear is that there didn't seem to be a controversy in the historical record about the negative effects of lead, yet exposure was widespread. But if lead poisoning had truly been an endemic, surely it would have been written about. And yet it's not even mentioned until the 7th century CE, when Byzantine physician Paul of Aegina describes chronic lead poisoning. However, subscribers of the theory would argue that chronic lead toxicity as we understand it today was very different to the Romans. Gout, which is correlated with chronic lead poisoning, was very well documented and recognized, for example. So what's the deal? Let's turn to archaeology. Examinations of skeletal remains from the Roman era revealed greater lead concentrations among affluent communities than poorer ones, and higher amounts compared to subsequent historical periods, that is until the Middle Ages, which saw another rise of lead use. Additionally, research done in 2019 using novel methods for identifying lead levels in ancient skeletons revealed that many dwellers in Roman-era London were exposed to toxically high doses of lead, 70 times greater than Iron Age bones in the same area. According to the researchers, These findings make it evident that lead toxicity was a lurking problem for more than half of the population in Roman Britain. It's important to note that all of this is a theory, and not widely accepted facts among classicists. Critics of the theory argue that it is simply impossible to quantify what Roman aristocrats and emperors actually ate or drank, and thus the relationship between ingested lead and blood lead levels is unknowable. It's also worth remembering that Romans diluted their wine with water. Unmixed wine was considered a drink of the barbarians, and so it's similarly difficult to calculate the varying proportions of water and wine used and how that influenced lead contamination. These scholars, who do accept that contamination from lead-tainted sweeteners and preservatives was undoubtedly a source of toxicity, warn that it should not be blown out of proportion. Firstly, lead containers were not necessarily used by the majority of the population, and the amount of sweetener added to wine was not standardized. Critics point to Pliny the Elder, who writes that there were 185 types of wine in his day, each with its own unique composition. Pliny himself preferred unsweetened wine, and if only sweetened wines were the most concentrated touchpoints for lead poisoning, then the extent of disease would therefore be dependent on the distribution in types of wine drank. Additionally, sapa and defrutum were not the only sweeteners and preservatives employed. Pitch, resin, ash, and seawater were added, aromatic spices such as myrrh, cinnamon, and saffron. This complicates any assumptions and calculations about lead poisoning deriving from sapa and defrutum, as we can't really know how much and how often it was used. Perhaps in theory they could have precipitated widespread lead poisoning, but not necessarily in practice. This all fits in line with why we have observed madness among emperors across civilizations who may not have been exposed to copious amounts of lead like Rome potentially was. Factors such as inbreeding to keep wealth and prestige within a family, and the corruption of power have long been linked to insanity. It is hardly a trait unique to lead, or Rome for that matter. For example, the decadent Emperor Nero was a product of incest, whose parents may have also had an inbred pedigree dating generations. While lead poisoning may have drained his mental faculties, inbreeding may have assured us that he had hardly any faculties to begin with. While scholars agree that lead poisoning did impact populations, the debate is far from settled on whether it played a significant role in the decline and fall of the Roman Empire towards the 5th century CE. There are simply too many factors and assumptions that have to be taken into account in order for us to reach any definite answer anytime soon. But thankfully, we know a lot more about the toxicity associated with lead than the Romans did. Lead poisoning would continue to be an endemic that plagued humanity long after Rome collapsed, from the colonial era to the Industrial Revolution. And by no means is it an issue relegated to the past. Today, occupational exposure remains a prominent issue in developing countries who lack stringent regulations. Our deadly dance with lead continues all these millennia later, changing and adapting with the times, but never truly fading away.